If you think that grammar is unnecessary for fluency, then I can guarantee you that you'll struggle to communicate effectively in Spanish.
Podré para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español.
I'm Hamid, I'm 16 and fluent in Spanish and 3 other languages. In this video I'll explain why grammar is actually essential to getting fluent in Spanish. And I'll teach you the method I use to learn grammar without memorization. And if you make it to the end of the video, then I have a free gift waiting for you. You know, the most popular ways to get fluent in Spanish usually do include a bit of grammar, but they do it in a very friendly, sort of non-scary way. That's like apps like Duolingo and stuff. But the first time I ever got introduced to this whole idea of learning Spanish without grammar was when I heard of something called Dreaming Spanish. And so Dreaming Spanish, this is their logo, is like this method, or it's also an app and a website. But the whole idea behind it is that you get fluent in Spanish not by learning grammar, but by watching essentially a shit ton of content. Basically, you watch native content and you start off at very slow, easy to understand native content. And then you basically work your way up by spending hundreds of hours of just going through it and essentially memorizing each thing. Now, the whole seller point there is that when we learned our own native language, we didn't learn any grammar rules or anything. Therefore, the best way to learn Spanish would be to do that exact same method. And initially, it sort of makes sense, but it's actually extremely fallacious, which just means that it's very logically flawed. You see, no matter the language, you will have to study grammar, because what grammar really is the logic behind sentences. And language, by definition, is just a new logic. That's why programming languages are called languages. It's just a new way of logically taking one meaning and translating it to another meaning. That's what the word translation means. You translate it from one logic, one way of thinking, one way of expressing yourself to another. And that's what languages are. They're just logic. And so because humans are logical creatures, even if you don't study grammar, humans by definition will create grammar as a byproduct of just being logical. Because if I told you that I speak is hablo and that I buy is compro, well then you can assume that llego has something to do with I, me, right? This is actually something to do with grammar. But even if I just told you these 3 words, because you saw this and because you're a logical human being, you're automatically going to create patterns and rules for yourself. And these rules are fundamentally what grammar consists of. You see, language is just something that humans made up. And so it's a byproduct of humans making something that it has logical parts in them and also illogical parts. There's also exceptions in language. And that's also a byproduct of humans making it. But the main byproduct of humans or anything intelligent at all is logic. It's patterns. And so that's kind of the short answer to why grammar is necessary to getting fluent in Spanish. It's because it's literally necessary, period. There's no working around it. Your human brain is going to create logic because humans are logical, and grammar is just logic. And so if grammar is necessary, then how should we study grammar? In my experience, the most high leverage way is through a framework I like to call the 3W. Most people find grammar extremely hard and excruciating, and it's because they don't do this exact framework. You see, in any Spanish sentence, there are 2 parts, okay? There are what the words are and then where the words are placed. And so most people memorize the what and the where, and those are the only things that are really required in a sentence, okay? This makes it not make sense, however. And this is the underlying issue with trying to skip grammar altogether, like, for example, Dreaming Spanish. If you think of something easy like ¿Cómo estás?, everyone knows the what and the where. So we know the word ¿cómo?, so we know what it is. We know the word estás, so we know what it is. And we know the order of where those are placed. We know it's not estás como, we know it's ¿cómo estás? So we know the what and the where. But the reason why most people struggle with grammar is because they don't understand the why. And this is fundamentally the constraint, because everyone wants to try to skip grammar, when in reality, it's necessary. But just because grammar is necessary doesn't mean you have to memorize everything. You see, memorization isn't necessary, but grammar is. Grammar is necessary, but memorization isn't. And so understanding the why means you don't have to memorize. And understanding the why is crucial. It's like, why does me gusta mean I like instead of yo gusto, right? And that's like a reason right there. There's logic behind that. There's reasoning for so much in Spanish. For basically every single sentence, every single tiny part, there's like a whole explanation, and it's all like historical. I think linguists actually go into like the very historical elements of that, but we don't really care about those historical elements. All we really want to do is just recognize that there's reasoning there and learn that reasoning. And the reason why is because when you understand why things happen, then it makes more sense. And when it makes more sense, then you remember it even better. And when you remember it better, then you save time. It's the underlying reason to why I saved over 200 hours of studying compared to the average learner, or why my client Eduardo saved 200 to 350 hours of studying compared to the average learner. It's because we're saving mental energy. It's because instead of memorizing aprendo, como, vivo, compro, etc., we just learned a few rules that unlocked all of those at once. And that's where it's at. It's leverage. And so the problem with most grammar textbooks and materials is that they firstly are written text, which means we're reading and writing. And I have other videos talking about why reading and writing is not the optimal way. And the real reason there is just the goal is fluency, right? The goal is to be able to have a conversation. Reading and writing are not in conversations. Therefore, it's a constraint. But primarily, it's because they don't teach the why. Because it's much more advantageous to understand a rule and a concept than it is to memorize examples where those concepts are applied. You see, it's the same thing like in math, right? It's like you learn a certain concept of like how something is used. You got introduced to this like idea of using like, I don't know, factorization or something. The E student would memorize all the examples where factorization is used. The A student would understand the concept of how it's applied. And that's why the A student gets an A, because when there's a question on the test that the E student hasn't memorized, the E student fails. But the A student still answers it because the underlying concept is the same. Because the A student doesn't memorize, he understands. And so when learning grammar, the way I did it and the way that has served me best is to firstly opt for audible sources like YouTube videos, online courses, etc. And that's, by the way, where Dreaming Spanish does hit the nail on the head, because as kids, that's also what we did when we grew up. We were just speaking and understanding language. We weren't doing anything else. But where it fails is to completely eliminate and eradicate any learning of grammar at all. And that's why the most important thing about learning grammar, real quick before we move on, after years of developing these frameworks and over 100 hours of coaching, I've packed everything into one clear step-by-step program. So if you're serious about learning Spanish, then check the link in the description to join. Back to the video. Is to make sure you understand why certain things happen. Asking the question why will get you to understand it better. And the better you understand why a sentence is constructed that way, the more sentences you'll unlock. And so memorizing gives you pieces, understanding gives you the system to build with those pieces. Because once you see a reliable pattern, a logic, or a grammar, then you can apply that rule to 1,000 different examples. A builder with a blueprint can design sturdy buildings over and over again, whereas a builder who just eyeballs it might get one right, but struggles to repeat that same success. Spanish sentences are the buildings, and grammar or logic, aka the why, is the blueprint. The guy who just memorizes a million different phrases using, the Dreaming Spanish method of skipping grammar and just watching hundreds of hours of content where native speak is like the builder who just eyeballs it. He might get one or two right, because by definition of repetition, you will eventually get something right. But having the intention to improve by being able to have repeatable concepts that are able to be applied to every single building or sentence is much more advantageous. And it's why the people, especially the people who use Dreaming Spanish, don't believe me when I say I got fluent in 120 hours of studying. Because in their minds, their experience, it would require 10 times the amount of effort to get the same amount of results. And it's like, the reason is because I have a blueprint and you don't. So here's just some visual pictures. You can see understanding helps you. And so here's an example of the difference it makes when you understand the why. And so I'm not just saying this, okay? Let me actually systematically prove this to you. The word for presentation in Spanish is presentación. Now, if I taught you it that way, where I just said presentación, you've learned one word. You've learned the what and the where. Now, let's say I said la presentación. Now you know the what and the where, right? You know the la comes before the presentation, and you know the word la means the. So it's presentation, the, boom, you know the what and the where. But I haven't taught the why to the what and the where. I haven't taught you why that is. So let's do that now. Words that end in ation in English become acción in Spanish, just obviously with the Spanish accent. And the reason for this is because historically, Spanish is a Latin language. I think it's about 75% of Spanish words come from Latin. And English is technically a Germanic language, but it has a ton of Latin roots. An example of this is like fetus comes from Latin, and coincidentally, presentation also comes from Latin. And so these words that end in ation in English are able to be converted to Spanish by making them acción with Spanish vowels, of course. And so here's a list. The list literally doesn't even fit in the presentation. So yeah. But for example, we have administration becomes administración. Admiration becomes admiración. Presentation becomes presentación. Contemplation becomes contemplación. Narration becomes narración. And that list is 194 words long for just one example of a rule. And there are like way more of those. And by the way, a little hint, the gift at the end is actually about this exact concept. So because I taught you the why, not only do you know the word for presentation, but now you know every single Asian ending word. So instead of learning one word, you learned 194 words. Instead of getting one building right, the builder of the blueprint got 194 buildings right. Do you see what I'm getting at here? And so this applies to not just this example. By the way, this grammar concept is called cognates. That's why I call it the cognate cheat code, which is based on this concept of why, understanding the why. And so why is it puedo instead of puedo? Right? This is called stem changing verbs, right? People like to use complicated words. I don't know why. Why is that? Most people don't explain it to you. Most people just skip over that. Most people just memorize them and just assume, oh, okay, it's just like that because it's like that. Why is it hablas? Where's the rule for that? Or do we just memorize it and just eyeball the sentences when we have to be in a conversation and actually speak fluently, right? I would prefer to not memorize these examples, but rather find the underlying reason behind them so that when I'm in a conversation, I can just pick these concepts out and use them to create my sentences on the fly, on the spot. Y entonces no se trata de memorizar, se trata de entender la lógica, entender la gramática. And that sentence I just said, I guarantee you, I haven't said that a single time in my life before now. But I'm able to say it in Spanish just like that because I've learned the why behind the grammar. So I'm not subjected to this guessing game. I just know because I've seen the pattern a million times and I've learned grammar directly. If you try to skip this, you are fundamentally subjected to memorization. And if that's the way you want to learn, fine. But I would rather save the hundreds of hours of studying and dedicate those hundreds of hours to other stuff. And so here's that free gift I was talking to you about. If you check the description, then you can grab my free, easy-to-use Cognate cheat sheet to instantly unlock thousands of Spanish words. There's no email needed, no need to opt in. You just click the link and boom. And that Cognate cheat sheet goes through basically all of the different examples of basically just transferring words from English to Spanish using these Latin roots. And so, I mean, there's around 12 or 13 rules. In this video, I gave you one of them, which was the presentación. You get literally like 10 plus more of those rules. And so, completely free. Just my thank you gift for reaching the end of this video. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed. You can subscribe if you want to. And yeah, stay humble.